Every school year near the time of Easter, Christian schools around the world teach students about the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. However, most, if not all of these schools teach the story from a New Testament perspective. As students grow, so does their curiosity on the topic, and they begin to question whether or not the story is historically accurate. They find themselves asking, what historically happened at the death and resurrection of Jesus? In order to know what historically happened, one should have at least a basic knowledge on the New Testament accounts of the story. The four Gospels have mostly similar accounts of Jesus' death, stating that Jesus was having his final dinner with his disciples before he was betrayed by Judas, who gave him to Roman custody for money. He was brought to Pontius Pilate, who in accordance to Roman law held a trial in which the crowd asked for crucifixion, and he complied to the chants of the crowd to avoid possible riots. Jesus was then crucified, and his body was placed into a tomb. The resurrection is where the Gospels begin to differ in their specific accounts of the death and resurrection of Jesus. In Mark, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, but found nothing but an open tomb. There a young man in a white robe told them that Jesus had been risen, and told them to go and spread the word that he was going to Galilee. However, the women were too afraid and said nothing. In Matthew, both of the Marys found an empty tomb, and an angel came down and told them that Jesus had risen, and to go and tell his disciples. Jesus then appeared to them on the way to Galilee, and later appeared to all of his disciples in Galilee. In Luke, the Marys and Joanna found an empty tomb, and two men in dazzling garments told them that he had risen. They rejoiced and told the disciples, who at first thought it was nonsense. But then Peter went to the tomb and saw Jesus' clothes, which made him rejoice. In John, Mary Magdalene saw an open tomb but nothing else. She then informed John and Peter, who inspected the tomb. Later, two angels and Jesus appeared to her, and in an alternate ending, Jesus appeared twice to the disciples. Although there are multiple accounts of the death and resurrection of Jesus, by looking at the context, one may make a compelling argument about what truly historically happened. Throughout Jesus' life, it is noted that he preached at multiple times, which meant he gained both followers as well as opposers. Among these opposers would likely have been fellow Jews, including high priests who formed a hatred towards Jesus. The power of his opposition led to big problems for Jesus. They likely told Roman authorities that Jesus was being referred to as the King of the Jews, which could pose a threat to the Romans. Judas, a disciple of Jesus, took note of this and saw a financial gain in it. Judas sold custody of Jesus to officials, who then brought him to Pontius Pilate. Larry Hurtado writes that Pilate saw this threat and wanted to get the message across to Jesus' followers that this would no longer be tolerable. Hurtado also writes that for this reason Pilate had Jesus crucified publicly, showing his followers this message. Since he was crucified while Pilate was presiding over Judea between 26 and 36 AD, the events of his death and resurrection must have occurred in that same time period. A few days after his death, a few women that were close to Jesus went to anoint his body, but instead found just an open tomb. They likely told his disciples, who believed this was nonsense, since women were not respected at the time. A few male disciples then likely visited the tomb and saw nothing but clothes, which would have been how this account was passed down, since it would only be passed down by men, not women. Everything else about Jesus appearing in Galilee or angels appearing was just added later on and simply cannot be read as historically accurate. Peter Steinfels mentions that Jesus actually resurrecting is something that cannot be historically proven. This means that his body was probably stolen by Roman authorities, since a proper burial was not usually allowed after a crucifixion.
Created using Powtoon.